My whole view with Bitcoin was always that it's much better to be pragmatic and lay out a moderate case, which is that it's a hedge in a portfolio against the sort of traditionalist financial infrastructure. And so many people would get mad because they would anchor on this extremist view that it had to be everything. It had to be the solution and panacea to everything. Right? When you think about products that really get to scale, there's a simplicity. And what that simplicity gives is people a very simple decision to make. Do I want to use this or do I not want to use it? And so if you want, for example, Bitcoin to get to mass market scale, the most powerful thing that you can do is describe it in simple, pragmatic terms that don't require zealous belief. And so it's just an example to me that sort of reinforces this idea that extremism never wins. And kind of like centrism is sort of the value maximizing function. It just requires sort of like a de-escalated, like I find that a lot of people in Bitcoin, and it's so funny because like many of them got there well after I did. They're just so arrogant about it. And I don't know, maybe I'm just dumber, but like, I just don't understand why people need to believe so much versus, view it more pragmatically and unemotionally. Because I think they'll find more success in the more unemotional, treatment of what it is. So like another example is like the entire DeFi movement. I got laughed at because somebody asked me, Laura Shin asked me what DeFi was. And I was like, I have no idea, but I own Bitcoin. And I was just telling the truth, which is like, I don't have the time to learn about all this stuff. And, at some point somebody will explain it to me and I'll know a little bit better, but it's not to say that it's not important, but it is to say that everything has a time and place. And if we are going to focus our energies on making Bitcoin mass market and scale, we have to dial down this zealous rhetoric and dial up pragmatist rhetoric. Pragmatist rhetoric is what will get your mother and your grandmother to have Bitcoin in their wallet. I've started an insurance company that's doing a bunch of very, very esoteric, exotic insurance policies. And one of the interesting things that I've learned with my co-founder, my partner in this, he's the CEO, I'm just the chairman, but is how many of these corporations view their balance sheets and, how they're buying all kinds of esoteric insurance. And the instant thing, Raoul, that pops to the top of my head is, wow, these guys should also own Bitcoin as something like that. If they're going to own cat bonds and they're going to own business interruption risk insurance and all kinds of, hedges on PMI, my gosh, why don't they own some Bitcoin? Well, it's because the presentation of that idea is done in such a way where they're forced to make a leap too far. And because if you decompose what the treasurer or the CFO is how the lens in which they're making decisions, it's just career risk. Right? It's that old adage. You're never going to get fired for buying IBM, right? And so you're never going to get fired for just having the money sit in a corporate account with earning zero at JP Morgan than, pounding your fists on the table for Bitcoin. So what we need is, again, more pragmatism around what it is. I've always found the presentation of the idea as a deeply, fundamentally uncorrelated hedge to the existing financial infrastructure to be kind of boring, not that salacious, but very pragmatic and effective. The SPAC is really important. Well, I'll give you why it's important to me, and then I'll give you why it's important to an entrepreneur. Selfishly for me, it allows me to basically be a conduit and act as a principal while I take companies public, meaning I can use my balance sheet to basically empower companies to fulfill a mission that I believe and underwrite in. And then I can be a big part of them as they grow and scale. And so, the only places to make money in the private technology markets are all the way up front at the Series A, the Sequoias and the Benchmarks and the Andreessens of the world. I used to do that at Social Capital. We did a good job, but it's very hard and the returns are extremely long dated. Or you just wait for these companies to get baked and do it at the back end, where instead of putting in tens of millions, you put in hundreds of millions or billions if you're able to do it. And you own the same amount as they end up owning anyways, 10, 12, 15, 20%. And then you can basically help them grow and scale. So that's selfishly, why I was attracted to a SPAC. But then now you get into the Venn diagram part of why I liked it and why it makes sense for an entrepreneur. It's because you can talk about the future. And the most important thing in underwriting returns, as you and I know, in disruptive technologies, is all about future returns. I don't care about 2019 and 2018. Tell me about 2028 and 2029. What is your plan? And the only way that you can talk about that when you're bringing a company public is through an S4 process, because it's a merger, because the S1 process doesn't allow that. The SEC rules are very strict around, basically talking about future prospects, future strategy, future cash flows. You can't even produce a forecast. So the S4 and a SPAC, at the intersection between now my desires and the entrepreneur's desires, is about talking about the future in detail. And then for the entrepreneur, what they get is, a couple of things that are not as important to me, but important to them, which is speed. You take an 18-month process and compress it to 100 days, and certainty of price. So you exactly know what your cost of capital is, and you and your board can underwrite that and decide whether that's too expensive or not. When you see how the establishment reacts to social media today, I would say that the US election is a great window into this. The 2016 election was about sort of, castigating Facebook. 2020 has really been the election of, throwing Twitter under the bus. But really what it is an emerging realization by both the left and the right that social media reallocates power and influence in a way that disrupts the allocation of power and influence. Meaning, it's much more likely, and Donald Trump, I think, is the canary in the coal mine, it's much more likely that future leaders of politics are really people that can coalesce movements online. And in that, you're much more likely for The Rock or Kim Kardashian or Charlie D'Amelio to be the next great politician than you are some person who's steeped in policy and who really understands what to do. Social media and just like the way that we organize ourselves now is becoming highly fragmented because you have a tendency to seek confirmation bias, and what that puts you into is your own echo chamber, whatever that is. That could be believers of climate change versus non-believers, vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers, QAnon people versus, non-QAnon people, across any dimension, no matter how normalized or no matter how extreme, political views are, you can find your own echo chamber and you'll stay there gladly because it's confirmatory. But, in a place like the United States where there's still only two political parties and the allocation of power is a binary decision between two people, I think what it means is that you then optimize for the lowest common denominator. And the political strategy in the future to win, I'm not saying it's right, but the strategy to win is one of centrism, because the centrist platform now embraces, 50% of the left's agenda and 50% of the right's agenda, because that's the only way mathematically to get a plurality. Just the way that the US is governed, the way the Electoral College works, the way that, these 50 states are really completely discontinuous bodies of electoral and political will.
So it's basically building a Venn diagram and looking for the most obvious connections.
That's exactly it. I think politics in America for the foreseeable future is a cold calculation of the intersection of Venn diagrams.
And one of the things that interests me, that I'm sure you've got a view on, is obviously online trust and digital identity. And, because somewhere within this, there's fake news and deep fakes, and, it's going to become an issue. We don't really know how to deal with it yet. How do we solve for this? Is this a blockchain solution, digital identity? How do you see this evolving? Because I think something big is going to come out of this, because out of crisis comes opportunity.
I think you're incredibly right here. My view on this is that we are, and I've said this before, and I think it triggers people, but it's true. But after 2000 and the attacks in the World Trade Centers on 9/11, we had the creation in the United States of something called the Patriot Act, and what that essentially allowed was a level of government oversight that we still have, and if anything has gotten even more dramatic than it was even 20 years ago. And what it is basically the creation in over the last 20 years of a modern surveillance state. And it's not just an American phenomenon. It exists all over Western Europe. It exists in Russia. It exists in China. It exists in every single country. But we made it okay. And it was under the guise of our physical safety.